Hello and welcome to this Maritime London webinar in partnership with Hill Dickinson, exploring what maritime business can do to prepare for the end of the transition period. Whether we like it or not, we cannot escape it. The end of transition is coming and UK businesses have to prepare themselves. And while it is true to say that there is a lack of clarity regarding the potential FTA with the European Union, it does not mean that companies, particularly exporters of physical goods, can afford to sit on their hands. There are mitigation strategies that can be actively deployed now to ensure that you can continue to trade after January the 1st. This webinar will explore these strategies, the practical issues, and the panel discussion that will follow will explore any potential upsides for the UK as a consequence of becoming an independent trading nation. We have promoted this webinar in partnership with our partner associations under the umbrella of Maritime UK, and it's very much aimed at the wider maritime community, as many of the practical issues covered in this webinar are not peculiar to our particular parish, or indeed maritime in general. However, given the expertise that exists within our membership, we felt that we should do our bit and support making the end of transition as manageable as possible for the UK's maritime businesses. I have been joined today by three people who have a huge amount of practical experience in regards to Brexit preparation, and I am sure no matter your business, you will come away from this hour feeling more prepared for what lies ahead than you may do now. Firstly, we have George Kelly of Hill Dickinson, who will speak on customs and the customs landscape post-transition. And George, I think you've made yourself known. And then we have Paul Samra, partner at Moore Kingston Smith, who will cover the potential implications for workers and students. And finally, Julian Walker, Chief Commercial Officer at ABP, who will talk on the preparations that UK ports have made to deal with the forecast disruption at the UK's frontier. Before we get started, I will provide a quick run through of housekeeping notices. Whilst we're all exceptionally well versed in these things now and certainly don't expect any tech issues, these things do occasionally happen, so please do bear with us. We will do our absolute best to minimize background noise, but I will apologize in advance about the fact that my neighbors have undertaken extensive building works during the current lockdown. And lastly, but importantly, you will be able to ask questions in the text box, and we'll look to cover off as many of those questions as we can at the end of the session. I think that's all from me now. And it gives me great pleasure to pass the floor over to George. George, over to you. Thank you.
Josh, thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my name is George Kelly. I'm a customs and indirect tax specialist with Hill Dickinson, and I have been for, well, over a decade now. Before that, I was a tax partner with KPMG. And I've always been specialising in customs issues. So what I'm going to do today, in the time available, I'm going to give you a brief summary, some of the issues that I come across in my advisory practice. What you will realise, I think, is that it's pretty basic stuff. Let me just... So it's not. So it can't be an exhaustive examination of the subject, as there's just too many issues or areas which are still in dispute. Yeah, the EU has got a long history of last-minute agreements, so we can't really say what the final outcome will be with certainty. But what we can do is to say these are the things that you have to do as of January next year. Free trade agreement or not, there are going to be changes in regulatory and documentary requirements, and they're definitely coming from the 1st of Jan next year. We can't get away from that. That's going to happen. So what about imports. Basic documents are really not going to change. You're still going to require things like invoices with required information on them, delivery notes. If you're using road transport, for example, CMRs are going to have to be filled out properly under company goods. Yes, it will be different for ship traffic, but an awful lot of goods are going to be moving by road and across the short sea crossings from here to France. But most of this information, it's already commercially required in any event. So you have those documents that I've spoken about just now. One of the things for importing companies or people who are bringing goods into the UK is that they're going to require some sort of customs broker or freight forwarder, which if the goods are coming in from the EU, they probably haven't required those before. And those kind of documents that I just mentioned will have to be presented to enable the preparation and submission to the revenue authorities of the relevant customs entry. The one thing everybody's going to need, probably a lot of people have got already, is an EORI number. That's on top of what's commercial information. That's an economic operators registration and identification number, which, by the way, will be required on both sides of the channel. The extra material that you're going to need from the beginning of next month, from beginning of January, sorry, is details about origin and tariff classification. Origin, we don't know whether that's going to be preferential origin, which allows zero or reduced duties to be paid, but in any event, they will depend on where the goods are, where they're being manufactured. So, for example, it won't be an issue for goods that have been entirely originating in this instance in the UK, but an awful lot of manufacturers use components or raw material from various countries, and that is going to be a requirement they're going to have to work out. If it's a percentage basis, which is a common basis where there's more than one country of origin, you're going to have to work it out what it is, and if necessary, change it a bit. I'll talk about that in a second in respect of exports, but in respect of imports, it will make a difference as to where the goods do come from, and exporters from UK will need to be able to make a declaration of origin that conforms with the regulations. Tariff classification is something that, again, a lot of the bigger companies will know this already, in terms of how to actually the actual tariff classification that's ascribed to their goods. The only thing I would say, and as an example, I've just been doing some work for an American company who's got a manufacturing site in the UK. Is, well, we got our tariff classification already, he says. Well, yeah, but it's not quite the right one, and a lot of companies, when they've used them for VAT declarations, have really kind of just looked at it and says, well, this will do. We don't really, nobody's ever queried it before. Well, they've never queried it because there's been no fiscal impact on that particular for those particular goods on that particular declaration. But in future, if duty is payable on the goods, then you can rely on the regulatory authorities to pay more attention. Customs regimes aren't really going to change much. There will, both sides of the channel, be inward processing relief, temporary imports, warehousing regimes. So they're not going to change really. But as far as I know, and I have to confess I haven't absolutely checked it, authorised economic operator status is the UK's arrangements aren't being recognised by the EU, although that might change. I've put at the bottom of this, sorry, at the top of the slide, what's a deferment account? And again, that's, to many of us, that's a fairly standard procedure that you have to undertake to pay duties in the UK or the country of import, but a lot of people just aren't used to it, especially if it's only EU to UK. So that has to be set up, and you have to have bank guarantees or insurance policies, and people are going to have to put those procedures in place. So that's imports. Exports is pretty much the same. You're going to have to make customs declarations on first entry into the EU, unless the goods be in transit. Basic documents are the same as imports. And again, you've got the extra requirements of being precise declarations of origin. And my example there is, you may have seen a few weeks ago, the car industry suddenly said, well, hang on, our cars aren't going to qualify as UK origin, preferential treatment or not. What are we going to do about that? And of course, the answer is, well, it depends on what the arrangements are. It depends on what the rules are. And as I said earlier, a very common way of working out what origin is whether there's the last significant transformation and/or the percentage of value on the ex-works price of goods. But of course, some people say, well, it won't qualify. Well, yeah. Sorry. But that really largely depends on whether there's a preferential free trade agreement. I think, as I mentioned, the UK remains in the Common Transit Convention, but if you are transiting goods either via France or one of the Benelux countries, then you are going to need some form of transit if it's going on or through any particular member states or two other member states. So some sort of presence is required for VAT and duty accounting. Some of my clients are just saying, well, if it's going Dover to Calais, we'll just declare the goods for free circulation in the EU at Calais, and then we'll just send them where we like. Others are saying, well, I don't really want to do that. I'd rather clear them in Germany, for example, because I've set up a subsidiary company or a branch office. And so people have got different ways of dealing with it. But there are resources out there who will say, I'll enter your goods for you at a cost, obviously, wherever the rules say that you have to have some form of presence. Brokerage resources, I think, the resources are out there, but there has been a lot of comment that have we got enough trained resources? Well, we're going to see. I think there has been some government support for actually getting that going, but it's pretty last minute stuff because we don't exactly know what you've got to train people to do. Tied up with Incoterms is where's the responsibility for paying duty, depending on whether it's delivered duty paid, which is what a lot of customers, from what I'm hearing, are saying. They don't want any real change, and that leads back to saying, right, well, we might have to clear the goods ourselves. Then what you get actually is, well, actually, the actual declared value may be an EU to EU value and not a UK to EU first value. And there are issues there about trying to work out what is the correct value. I've given a what you call it, a link to the UK government exporting from GB to the EU, and it's quite a good one. The actual total document is, a long document, and it's far too complex for most people. But this is quite a good one, and it gives you some good decision trees. So that might be helpful if you need some guidance. Regulatory authorities, just trying to encompass a look at that. I do a lot of disputes work with HMRC and the border force, and quite frankly on import. They're frustrating, and I'm being polite when I use that word. There has been, they've issued something, although I don't think from the border force, perhaps they have, certainly from HMRC, they'll say, oh, there'll be a light touch regulation. Well, I've seen that before, and it might last for a few months, but they can't help themselves once they start. Once they start getting their teeth and acting normally, they can be a complete nightmare to deal with, and that's on both sides of the channel. One of the big issues there is that with the new system, customs declaration system, which is an upgrade from the old sheath computer entry system, is that they have said that they will delay the requirement for a full customs entry and payment of duties into the UK until July of next year, July 21. We'll see how that works. Special regimes, alcohol, tobacco, I think, they're already a nightmare for legitimate traders, and there's plenty of potential for things to go wrong. Northern Ireland, there's still a lot of uncertainty among traders, but in theory, Northern Ireland goods have unfettered access to the EU states. So how that's going to work, well, we'll see. And opportunities, well, UK manufacturers might look at it and say, I'll tell you what, we'll move what we want to Northern Ireland if they can. Just-in-time changes, well, it may be that some people will say we've got to move storage or open storage facilities either in the EU or the UK. Well, we'll see. Substitution, that's where you change your point of supply, from elsewhere in the EU or third countries into EU manufacturers, and thus allowing things like origin to be achieved, or preferential origin rather. And transport, well, a lot of brokerage positions and jobs are going to be created in the coming years. So that's all I wanted to say at the moment, and anybody who wants any questions, be happy to answer them later. Thank you.
George, thank you for that. Full of a lot of practical advice there for exporters as we head towards transition, and perhaps we will get into this a bit more in the Q&A. But to me, it seems very clear from your presentation that actually, the FTA is only a very small part of all of this, and much of what we need to do has already been relatively well defined. And on that note, and I'm sure we'll add further grist to that particular mill, I'd like to pass over to Paul. So Paul, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Joss, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Yes, I'm the Brexit impact specialist at Moore Kingston Smith, and certainly the issues are by no means clear in certain areas, as George has alluded to. But in respect of people, I'll just highlight a couple of things on people and staff and the implications, and also touch on a bit of tax, because you wouldn't expect an accountant not to comment on tax. So where are we? Right, let's and where are we on the slides? There we go. Right. People. Now, this has been out in the open for many, many months. People that voted for Brexit, some people it was claimed were doing it on the basis of their personal issues with immigration. The government decided that actually they would bring about a change in movement of people from the EU 27 into the UK, and that all takes effect effectively from the end of the year. So by the 31st of December this year, if you have staff that have been living in the UK for 5 years or more, then they can apply for permanent residence, British citizenship. It's called settled status is the application that they will make, because they will have been here 5 years. You may already have staff that are EU citizens, but they have been here 5 years. Fine, they can go on. There's an app available. It covers criminality checks. It's all automated and it's free. So big tick in the box. Do check your staff and indeed their families, because you wouldn't want an individual to be able to stay, but their family not being able to stay. Now, if you've got someone from the EU 27 who's been with you or been in the country, been in the UK less than 5 years, I don't know why that moved. If they've been in the UK for less than 5 years, then they can still stay. They're able to stay in the UK, but they should apply, in actual fact, for pre-settled status now. And then once the 5 years are up, they can apply for settled status. So this aspect of application, really, everyone who is an EU 27 citizen should be applying one way or another, either for pre-settled status or settled status. And this applies to anyone who's entered the UK before the end of the year. And you must actually apply for settled or pre-settled status by 30th of June. So big action point for your staff. And it might be sensible for you to identify your migrant workforce and investigate where, when their visas expire at the moment, if they're you've recruited them, be aware that short-term business visitors may end up changing their status. So if they're here on a short-term basis, watch this space. Seasonal workers, there's lots of uncertainty about seasonal workers. I'm sure it will be clarified if there's a deal as to what will happen. But the big takeaway action point is to actually check your workforce and their extended family. Right, so what's happening from 1st of January on the people front? Well, free movement ends, which means that if you are going to recruit from the EU 27, you will need, as a business, to be a Home Office licensed sponsor. That job offer must be at the required skill level. The candidate must speak English to a good standard. And effectively, as a Tier 2 recruit, they must have an education that's broadly at A-level standard. The minimum salary that you should be offering is 25,600 per annum, or a lower sum, 20,480, if the skill is on the shortage occupation list. So be aware that if you are unable to recruit within the UK, you're going to have to go through some hoops if you are looking to bring people in to the UK from the EU 27. In terms of employment law, old judgments will remain in effect, until or unless legislation is repealed or reenacted. So Brexit has no effect unless changed in terms of UK employment law. So many core employment rights, such as right to protection from unfair dismissal, remain. So on to the next one. So students and bringing students into the UK, and they just follow the pre-settled and settled status aspect that I mentioned earlier, if they're in the UK before 1st of January. But if they're studying, be aware that the 21-22 academic year, the home fee status will cease, and effectively they'll be on much higher fees for paying for their studying at universities or wherever. If they've arrived in the UK after 1st of January, so well into post-Brexit period, they will require a student visa, and also if they want to access the NHS, there's a £470 immigration health surcharge to pay every year. The UK graduate route, in terms of university students, enables a 2-year stay after they've graduated. So that is a bit of a plus there for them. So be aware that they will require visas going forward, and they will only be able to stay for 5 years if they're on a degree course and graduate successfully. And now I keep on using the arrow, and I shouldn't. I should click. Withholding taxes. So at the moment, we're in a free market economy, EU 28. If you have subsidiary companies within the EU, they can flow money cross-border without any tax implications at all. So dividends between companies, interest payments, royalty payments can be made without any deduction of tax. We suspect, and indeed if there's no deal, it will be the case, that there would be withholding tax charges post 1st of January that will be put in place by various EU 27 countries, and therefore they will charge a tax element which may or may not be recovered from the UK end. So important, if you are an overseas entity or you have an overseas subsidiary and they're rich with cash at the moment, you might want to consider bringing some cash over now when you have no punitive tax charges. So that's a quick whiz through. There's lots of other implications about Brexit, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. So happy to take them when the time comes. Hope you found that useful, and those are my details. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you for that. And again, a really useful overview. I must admit, I've tapped out a couple of questions regarding Home Office license sponsoring and the postgraduate route, but we'll get to that in the Q&A, I think. And now, I'd like to pass over to Julian from ABP. It's great that Julian's here with us today from our partner association, UK Major Ports Group. And Julian, over to you to consider some of the practical implications that ports are dealing with at the moment. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Joss, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Julian Walker. I'm the CISO of Associated British Ports. I will try and cover sort of ports in general, but I will obviously come with an ABP focus because obviously that's what I'm most familiar with. So government has been very clear to us and to the industry that whatever happens in respect of a free trade agreement, there will be changes in respect of border controls from the 1st of January going forward. I think everybody is probably aware, but I will touch on it, the 3-phased approach that will come from the respect of inspecting goods from the 1st of January 2021. So phase 1 which will kick off 1st of January, we'll see that customs controls will apply on controlled goods, but importers of standard goods will be able to defer payment and declarations for 6 months. Phase 2, which will then kick in on the 1st of April 2021, will see health checks being extended to all products of animal origin, which will require declarations but will not be subject to physical checks at the border. And then the real time that creates change at the ports will kick in phase 3 on the 1st of July 2021, when all goods will require customs declarations and will be subject to the relevant tariffs. There will be sanitary and photosanitary checks will take place at designated border control posts. And the BCPs, as they have now been renamed as opposed from BIPs, will be a change in terms of the infrastructure requirements at ports. And this is where there has been a large amount of planning, both within ABP, but in the border port sector over the last few years. And most recently, government has realized that there is still more to be done, which is why they introduced the Port Infrastructure Fund, which many of you will have seen during the press. From an ABP perspective, we have been working very closely with government departments and the local port health in order to make sure that these BCPs are in place under the new border operating model. In addition to the physical infrastructure, we're also putting in new processes to ensure that there is a continued free movement of goods under the new border operating model and the CTC, the Common Transit Convention. As part of this, we do have the authorised economic operator status, but as George rightly pointed, at this point in time, the EU have said that they won't recognise it, albeit I think everybody is hopeful that that will be the case come the 1st of January, but obviously that would be subject to an FTA. As part of this process, obviously, we need to make sure that there is the implementation of inventory linking in order to make sure that goods can be registered, and that will be obligatory from that 1st of July 2021. More broadly, from an ABP perspective, we have been preparing for this for a while. Since June 2016, we've invested over £250 million in infrastructure, which will be directly linked into new trading arrangements. So it is about putting more capacity into our ports. We've invested over 50 million in cranes and yard handling equipment up in the Humber, where we will see and are seeing already an increase in volumes as people look to reduce their reliance on the short sea straits and move goods through other ports. Now, collaboration and communication is obviously critical in times like this. And from an ABP perspective, we set up something called the UK Trade Resilience Forum, which brought together representatives from government departments, and we were fortunate enough to have ministers attending, and then representatives of supply chain. So we had representatives from the retail sector, we had shippers, we had freight forwarders. And what we also did is involved a number of EU port operators in order to commence the dialogue, open the multilateral but also bilateral communication links between ports, importers, in order to make sure that the conversations were happening in advance. And that has been supported well by trade associations such as UK MPG, and I hope that will have resulted in there being some resilience in the supply chains that exist between the UK and the EU. In saying that, there clearly is still a lack of clarity, as I think we are all aware. And as part of the process that we have with the government in respect of the Port Infrastructure Fund, and from what I understand, the vastly oversubscribed bids that have been put in for the 200 million, I think it just shows where we stand on what still needs to be done to make sure that the infrastructure is in place by the 1st of July 2021. So clearly, lots still to do, and we hope to get some clarity soon. But saying that, after January next year, we do see there being significant opportunity in terms of the benefits that it could bring to ports. From a pure rebalancing perspective, we are already seeing importers, logistic companies, freight forwarding companies, etc., introducing resilience into their supply chain by moving cargoes away from the short sea straits. As everybody is aware, over 4 million units transit through the short sea straits per annum, and the UK supply chain is hugely reliant on that at the moment. So we are seeing a modal shift of away from accompanied ro-ro to unaccompanied ro-ro, and also to short sea containers. So this is creating opportunities that ro-ro operators, short sea feeder operators, and also freight forwarders are picking up already. Clearly, that is going to have greatest impact for the East Coast ports, but there's also relevance, obviously, of trading into Ireland. I think what is also very interesting, which will have an impact on ports, is changes to cabotage rules and the impact that will have on the availability of truck drivers in the UK. The majority of trucks that transit through the short sea straits are EU truck drivers. And as it stands at the moment, it is not clear what the cabotage rules will be. So any truck that is delivering goods to the north, to Scotland, to the Midlands, it is clearly a reasonable distance from Dover, and the truck driver, if they're an EU truck driver, under the present cessation of the cabotage rules, will no longer be able to do journeys within the UK. Right. So I'm back again, so I'm not quite sure. Apologies for that. But just touching on the cabotage, so we expect there will be a reduced amount of capacity for truck drivers within the UK, and that again is resulting in importers and logistics companies and freight forwarders to reduce the UK truck element of the leg, and therefore bring the cargoes to ports closer to the final destination. Now, this has a number of benefits, not least reduced truck miles in the UK, and also the environmental benefits that go with that. And I think there was a study done by Hull Logistics Institute where they estimated that if 10% of cargoes shifted from the Port of Dover up to the Humber, which is the ports ABP operate on the East Coast, if 10% of the cargo that was going to the central east-west corridor, so that's Manchester, Leeds, Doncaster, shifted from the Port of Dover to the Humber, it would save about 100,000 tonnes of CO2 each year. And in discussions that we have with our customers, cost, time, and environmental footprint are increasing important. So we expect that will also provide additional emphasis in terms of shifting supply chain. Freeports, this is something that obviously has been mentioned over the last couple of years. It's clearly a strong government initiative. Again, we wait to see when the prospectus is released, hopefully over the next 4 weeks, exactly how the process will work on what the UK government's vision of a UK Freeport will be. But that will certainly present opportunities, and we wait to see the extent of those opportunities. And as ABP, we will be submitting a number of bids. We're still doing the final assessments, but we expect to be submitting a pan-Humber bid, a bid through Southampton, and then also in South Wales. And I think the message that we are putting to government when we speak to them at the moment is that in addition to the three key areas that they've raised as beneficiaries from Freeport status, so levelling up, boosting trade and innovation. We very much see, the delivering of net zero, the drive to decarbonisation as a key additional opportunity. And I think that's very much coupled with both the government policy in terms of driving offshore wind. Many of you will have seen the government also recently launched a £160 million fund to support landside infrastructure for offshore wind, and the growth of the hydrogen sector and associated carbon capture and storage, which is obviously growing very rapidly. So we certainly feel it's an extremely exciting time to be in the port sector, to be in the UK port sector. It is creating challenges. A lack of clarity is not making life easy, but coupled with Brexit and coupled with the drive for decarbonisation, it is certainly going to be a very, very interesting time in the port sector over the next few years. So thank you very much, and that's it from me.
Julian, thanks so much for that. I must admit, of all of the potential advantages of leaving the European Union, I didn't think that a potential reduction in carbon was one of them. So that's a fascinating insight by itself, to be honest, Julian. So thanks so much for that. It's great to see that we've got a number of questions coming through on the chat at the moment. As I said, we'll do our best to get through all of those, and I'll try and encapsulate a number of them within the discussion that we are about to have. And I think, first of all, Paul, I had just a couple of questions in regards to your presentation, which I'm sure you won't be able to go into huge amounts of detail about given the time. But the first one was regarding the need to get a home office license to be a sponsor. Is that a particularly onerous process for UK employers, or is it one that is relatively straightforward and can be done over a cup of tea in 20 minutes sort of thing?
Probably about 3 cups of tea over. No, it's about 8 weeks to arrange. The application cost depends on the size of the entity, but it's not huge. If you're a small entity, it's £536. If you're a medium to large entity, it's just under 1,500, and then a similar fee to renew each year. And then on top of that, you've got an immigration health surcharge, £400, and then no doubt you'll want to spend a bit of money to kind of get to the front of the queue. So there are priority service fees as well, and translation fees and third-party fees as well on top. So I think you could be looking probably at around £5,000 or so, and allow 8 weeks or so to arrange.
So the message there is relatively clear. If you haven't done it and you feel like you need to, then you need to get cracking now, sort of thing.
Yeah.
If you're going to be if you're going to be well placed for January the 1st. So yeah, no, thanks for that additional bit of information there. And just looking at what's coming through on the chat as well, and it's a question that I sort of considered during your presentation, Paul, regarding the postgraduate route. And excuse me for my ignorance when it comes to this. Is this only for EU nationals who have taken an undergraduate course within the UK who are then looking to take a postgraduate qualification, or is it for those undergraduates who have achieved their degree, who are looking to enter the UK workforce? How does that work, I suppose?
If they're intending to go into employment, they would need to change their visa. But if they are continuing to study, then they could stay. Sorry, let's rephrase that. Actually, all international students in the UK will be able to apply for the UK's new graduate route, stay in the UK for 2 years after their degree to work or look for work at any skills level. So they will get a 2-year extension having graduated. Yeah, that's basically it. So they will have had to have graduated, then they get the 2-year extension to either work or look for work. Yeah, does that answer your
yeah,
point?
no, I think that definitely makes sense. So
But they would have to have done a university degree.
yes, but you essentially can attain your university degree and be unemployed within the UK for 2 years whilst you search for gainful employment. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Fine. No, that's again a useful bit of information to know, because of course we have a lot of EU nationals studying maritime, commercial maritime courses within the UK, and I know that we've got some educators on the call today. George, just going on to you, and Julian did a very good job at highlighting some of the opportunities for port operators and associated industries in the context of Brexit. But for the physical exporters of goods in the short to medium term, are there any opportunities that you can highlight that will potentially stem from the uncertainty, I suppose, that the next couple of months are going to entail?
Well, definitely the freight forwarder sort of stroke customs broker, depending on what you want to call it, where you're from. There will definitely be increased opportunities for work in those kind of areas. People are asking me questions, so yes. But it depends to a certain extent on what kind of company you're in. As an example, when the Brexit vote first came in, I spoke to a former colleague of mine who worked for a big European manufacturing company, who said, "We're just going to work to a no deal because there'll never be a deal." And it's a big company, very well connected. So we will work to that, from the get go, and we won't be disappointed if it all ends nicely, but we don't think it will. Whereas I think, as I mentioned earlier, some people are just starting to ask the questions, the practical questions now. But I think immediately, apart from those trying to get to grips of what's going on, not so many in the medium term, most certainly. If you've got the potential for subsidiary companies or branch offices, if you're in distribution, and you're in particular industries who operate just-in-time procedures, it's I think from memory, Dell in some of their operations just have one assembly plant, and they're just literally surrounded by suppliers who've got their own storage facilities and their own sub-assemblies, and they're literally across the road, but they're not part of Dell. Now that might have changed a little bit over the years, but so people will, I think, they'll adapt because they'll have to, because things will change. But so in the medium term, I think it'll become a lot clearer.
Yeah, thank you for that, George. And Paul, I can see that you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think an opportunity might present itself depending on the markets that you're in, given that the UK global tariff regime and the tariff regime generally, we might find with FTAs with other countries that actually it becomes cheaper on the duty aspect, and therefore you might not have thought about a particular country, a particular market, and it presents an opportunity. So certainly I think the key is to look very closely at these FTAs that are coming through with countries like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and once they all get the final sign-off, to look at it closely, and there may well be enhanced opportunities there in the markets.
That I temporarily lost you there, but yeah, no, I mean, thank you for that, Paul. And it sort of leads nicely into another question, I suppose, and it might be for all three of you. There's been much made of FTAs with jurisdictions outside of the EU and the potential opportunities for the UK, both positive and negative. I think it's fair to say, whether they are simply going to be a rehash of what already exists with the European Union, or whether it does create, genuine opportunities for UK exporters, or actually to support inward investment into the UK. Do you have a view as a panel in regards to the tangible opportunities that FTAs with jurisdictions outside of the European Union may create? And Julian, as a port operator, I'm sure that this has been an area relatively close to your heart. So why don't we start with you there?
Yeah, no, certainly. I'm going to come with a sort of the weak answer to start with, and saying clearly the devil will be in the detail. So wherever we end up with the EU, but also the broader FTAs that are in negotiation at the moment. But I think there are definite opportunities, and if we look at let's say the UK car automotive sector in particular as one area, and there's been much made as to what could happen in terms of tariffs between the UK and EU. But where do we get to in terms of future trade arrangements whereby the opportunity for UK car manufacturers to be able to export to jurisdictions outside of the EU on a more attractive basis than where we are today? And I think what will be fascinating going forward, which could benefit the UK port sector, may not, is where we have seen UK manufacturers putting facilities into Europe to build certain brands of cars, certain models, on what that will mean going forward. And I think this is where there is a lot of potential, different scenarios that could come up going forward. But from a port sector, yes, we are looking at it very closely. We're also and we may come onto this in a bit more detail in a moment, the free port status and what that could provide in terms of structure for ports, and then how that will give the opportunity for port operators with land banks similar to what ABP have, to be able to attract port-centric manufacturing into jurisdictions close or onto land in and around the ports, and taking advantage of that, which will obviously help boost the levelling up agenda and innovation. So yeah, there's a lot that could happen. We just have to wait and see to a certain extent.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, George or Paul, do you have anything further to add there? I suppose, George, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, what I've just following on from Julian is that people have one of the issues I've seen reported when you're talking about a manufacturing environment is that people are saying, because we operate just in time, we haven't got any storage, and there's a shortage of space. Well, people have got the potential for commercial or industrial storage to be created. Up in the northwest, you drive along the M62, and some of the storage facilities that you can see are just immense. I mean, they are absolutely huge, and they've grown up with the increase in parcels and home deliveries. So definitely that kind of area people will be looking for. And the only question is, well, how big a shed can you build?
I mean, just on stockpiling and stock and warehousing, I heard a story a few weeks ago given most of us are working from home and have been since March, the spare office space, some of the spare office space, or unused office space, I should say, is actually being used for storage, because there's such a shortage of warehousing that actually office space is being used to stockpile. And if anyone is doing stockpiling, just watch your insurance cover to make sure that your insurance cover is covering that level of stock. But going back to your original question, the opportunities presented by tariffs which may well be lower in some cases as compared with what we are tied to with the EU 28, is definite opportunity for new markets.
Yeah, Paul, thank you for that. Just looking at the question panel, and we'll look to just cover off a couple of these. And Christina, you've asked a couple of interesting sort of very shipping specific questions there. And just to say that, you know, certainly there is no plan or unintended consequence in terms of UK or cabotage trades being carried out within the UK, those vessels having to be UK flagged. We're certainly not in the game of creating any sort of Jones Act equivalent treaty as an unintended consequence of Brexit. And in regards to crew change, I'm no expert here, but I can't foresee any way in which crew changes from the UK into the European Union would be hampered by our exit from the European Union. Alan, you've asked a question which is perhaps best for Julian to have a crack at, regarding whether you know, the physical vessel will be delayed as a consequence of leaving the European or the end of the transition period, or whether the cargo can be cleared when it is in the port. Julian, do you have a view on that one?
Will the vessels be delayed? Clearly, there is a risk that vessels will get delayed because you get massive amounts of congestion within the ports. And you know, if we look at, and I'm using Dover as the example because that's what everybody is familiar with. But you know, the risk there is that you know, you get sort of blockages within the port. You don't get the free flow of goods. The ports then get up to capacity, and consequently you lose your productivity, so you can't shift through as much. So I think, you know, that is where the UK port sector in general, and certainly as ABP, has been putting additional capacity into their infrastructure and their networks to make sure that, you know, we can handle more goods. In respect of whether cargo can be held and then cleared within the port, that's the case at the moment. So you know, we have temporary storage areas, and this is where the inventory linking will come in. So cargoes will be able to come into ports. They will be able to sit in the TSAs, the temporary storage areas, and you know, then they will be cleared through chief as they are today. So, you know, this is another area potentially where Freeports can add, but you know, at the moment it's possible. So as long as we don't see a complete, you know, breakdown of the supply chain system, you know, cargoes will continue to flow.
Yes, thanks for that, Julian. But of course, you know, one can foresee if there are any delays to vessels, some rather complex demurrage claims, which, you know, as George pointed to, there's, you know, the lawyers will always win out. So yeah, I'm sure they'll be able to get their heads around.
I'm not too sure I said that.
Some rather difficult, some rather juicy demurrage claims as a consequence of leaving the European Union. But, anyhow, just to go on to Freeports, and again, Julian, you covered this off a little bit in your presentation, but there's been a lot said about Freeports, and obviously the government hasn't, you know, released its vision in terms of what is meant by a Freeport in the context of the UK. But from ABP's perspective, what would you like to see? What's your sort of vision for a Freeport within the UK?
You know, we submitted responses to the consultation that happened in the earlier part of this year, and I think, you know, from our perspective, the government's guides in respect motivation in terms of levelling up, boosting trade and innovation is a good, you know, three areas to focus on. We would also said, and we made this clear, that the government should be ambitious. If it's going to do this, you know, you've got one shot, so get it right, and therefore facilitating, you know, the net zero, the decarbonisation agenda should be part of that. And I think, you know, we've also been very clear is that you know, the restrictions that have been talked about in regards to a contiguous zone or a 45-kilometre diameter, again, restrict the possibility. And I'll just use an example where we're looking at up on the Humber, and you know, we're in discussions with a number of big industrial operators up on the Humber. The Humber is the single biggest emitter of CO2, with British Steel up there, big power producers and refineries. And there is an opportunity that to bring the Humber together under that Freeport status to help drive, hydrogen, carbon capture, etc. So it is this point that we've said with government: you have to be ambitious, use the opportunity, think beyond the 3 areas that have been mentioned, which all in themselves are good, but we think the opportunity is bigger than that. What we have also been very clear in saying is that we do not see, and we do not want to have, an erosion of employment law within these free ports, or an erosion in the environmental protections that are installed within the planning process. And I think that's something that we've been very clear on, that we don't want that, and we don't see the need for it. So, as part of the discussions that people would have read about in the press, there are, the opportunity is there for the government to get it right, and I just hope, that they do, and we'll see hopefully in the next month or so.
Yeah, thanks for that, Julian. And I think the hour mark has just passed, which means our official time is now up. But I think, assuming that our panelists don't have anywhere to disappear to right away, I've just got one more question for you, and I suppose it's obligatory when we are talking about these sorts of things. And in your personal opinion, and don't worry, we won't hold you to this or replay your comments on this after January the 1st. But are you hopeful that we will reach a trade agreement with the European Union within the allotted time? Looking at the press reports, one can't help but feel that there is movement and at least a positive dialogue between both sides. But as a passing shot, I'd be really interested to get your thoughts. And why don't we start with George on that one?
Well, I think there will be some agreements, whether it's a sector agreement or an overall agreement. I'm not quite sure. I think, as I also referred to, is that the EU have got form for making late agreements. The hot breath down the back of your neck might focus minds. I sincerely hope they do.
Yeah, thank you for that, George. And Paul, any final thoughts on this?
I think the election of Joe Biden has probably swung the pendulum a bit towards a deal, because the internal market bill that was thrown out by the Lords is still hanging around, and the issue with Northern Ireland clearly rankles an awful lot of people, notwithstanding the fact it's changing what was already agreed. Yes, I totally agree with George. There will be something, I'm sure, even if it's just a statement of intent and they deal with all the legal stuff after 1st of January. But I suspect that around the Queen's Christmas Day broadcast, we might get some information.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that entirely. I think certainly from a personal perspective, hope that common sense prevails and we have a clear deal. But the reality is, I think it's going to go to the wire, and we will manage under that scenario, manage the consequences in that manner. But I'm certainly very hopeful.
Julian, thanks so much for that, and again, a huge thank you to all of our panelists and to Hill Dickinson, who worked very hard behind the scenes to put this together. As I think we've said in the chat, the presentation will be on our newly constituted, or the webinar will be on our newly constituted YouTube channel as of tomorrow, and I encourage you all to go and visit that for lots of other interesting webinars on the shipping industry, and we will send slides to those who want it. And lastly, I think we've covered off most of the questions in the side panel, but if you've got any other specific questions that you'd like to answered, please do contact us in slow time, and we'll do our best to provide any further clarifications. So again, thank you so much to all of our panel. I think that's been a really insightful and really useful hour. And that's everything from us. So thank you again, and look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks when we'll have our next webinar. So thanks again. Bye-bye.
Great.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.